Daniel Price married his mother-in-law, Linda Carter, just 2 days after his wife Emily was found brutally murdered in their kitchen. But the most disturbing part wasn't the wedding. It was the secret Emily left behind, a hidden message that would unravel everything they tried to bury. Branford had always been the kind of place where crime seemed like something that happened on the evening news, never at home. It was a quiet, tree-lined town, with just one diner, one gas station, and a police force small enough that most officers doubled as neighborhood dog catchers or traffic guides for the local high school. People left their doors unlocked and trusted their neighbors. It was the kind of place where you could go your whole life without hearing a single police siren. That peace shattered on a Thursday morning in October. At exactly 7:38 a.m., a frantic 911 call came in. The voice on the line was calm, almost too calm, saying only, "My wife, she's not breathing. There's blood. A lot of blood." The dispatcher tried to keep the caller on the line, but he hung up. Within minutes, officers arrived at the small cream-colored house at the edge of Maple Drive, where Daniel Price stood barefoot on the porch, his hands covered in something that looked suspiciously like engine grease and blood. Inside, the scene was grim. Emily Price lay on the cold tile kitchen floor, her head turned awkwardly to one side. Her eyes were open, staring blankly at the cabinets. 5 clean stab wounds marked her chest, each precise, none of them frantic. There was no sign of forced entry, no overturned furniture, no signs of a struggle, just silence, the ticking of a wall clock, and the strong, metallic smell of blood. Daniel told the police he had left early that morning to work on a neighbor's car. He said he came home just before 7:30 to find his wife lying on the floor. He claimed he panicked and tried to wake her, touching her neck, trying to find a pulse. But Detective Ray Holloway, a seasoned officer with heady years under his belt, immediately noticed something off. Daniel had no visible signs of panic, no tears, no trembling, just a blank expression that didn't quite match the horror of the scene. Emily's hands were clean. No defensive wounds, no knife near her body, just the blood and the lifeless quiet of a home that had gone still too fast. Neighbors gathered across the street, watching in hushed disbelief as the house was roped off with yellow tape. They spoke in low voices, mostly about Emily. She had been well liked, a school teacher who always brought cookies to bake sales and volunteered at the library on weekends. No one had a bad word to say about her. Daniel, on the other hand, was harder to read. A mechanic who mostly kept to himself. He wasn't unfriendly, just distant. Reserved. People assumed he was just a quiet man. But now they wondered. Word spread fast. Emily Price, 32, murdered in her own home. By mid-morning, the small police department was overwhelmed with tips, theories, and gossip. People speculated about break-ins, jealous lovers, and even random strangers passing through town. But Detective Holloway didn't believe in random. In his experience, murders like this were almost always personal. What caught his attention immediately was the kitchen itself. Nothing was missing, nothing stolen. Her purse still hung by the back door, untouched. Her phone was found neatly charging in the living room. It didn't feel like a robbery. It felt like something colder, calculated. Daniel was taken in for questioning that afternoon. He answered every question clearly, without hesitation. His alibi: he'd been next door in the garage, replacing brake pads. No one could confirm if that was true. The neighbor he mentioned was out of town, no security cameras, no witnesses, just his word. But then came something odd. Linda Carter, Emily's mother, showed up at the station that evening. Not in tears, not even angry. She was calm, too eerily so. She asked to speak to Daniel and waited in silence when officers refused. Holloway made note of it. A mother should be inconsolable after losing her only daughter. Instead, she sat still in the lobby, her eyes dry, her face expressionless. Something wasn't right. Holloway felt it in his gut. A murder without struggle. A husband without grief. A mother without tears. And a house filled with too much silence. It was only the beginning. The funeral was held just 3 days after Emily's murder. The church was filled with flowers, soft organ music, and the quiet sobs of people who couldn't believe she was gone. Her students left hand-drawn cards by her casket. Her co-workers cried in the back pews. Friends whispered to each other, confused, shocked, and heartbroken. But among all the grief, one face stood out for what it didn't show: Daniel Price. He didn't cry, he didn't speak. He barely moved. He stood at the front like a statue, expressionless, staring at the closed casket as if it meant nothing. Some thought he was in shock, too numb to feel anything. But others noticed something different. He wasn't just quiet, he was detached, cold. Even stranger was how close he stayed to Linda Carter, Emily's mother. While others kept their distance in mourning, Daniel and Linda sat together, side by side. She didn't cry either. She rested her hand on Daniel's knee at one point. A gesture so small most wouldn't notice, but those who did never forgot it. Zoe Mitchell, Emily's best friend, watched them closely the entire time. Something was wrong, deeply wrong. She just didn't know what it was yet. That evening, after the funeral, Zoe stopped by Linda's house to drop off a photo album Emily had lent her. She expected to find Linda grieving in silence, maybe lying down from the emotional weight of the day. Instead, she found Linda in the kitchen, wearing Daniel's old hoodie, the one he always wore to the garage. She was calm, drinking tea, and didn't seem surprised to see Zoe. When Zoe asked how she was holding up, Linda simply said, "Things will settle soon. Everything always finds its way." The words echoed in Zoe's mind all the way home. What did she mean by settle? What was going to find its way? 2 days later, rumors swept through Branford like wildfire. Daniel and Linda had gotten married. No announcement. No reception. Just a quick, quiet ceremony at the county courthouse. No witnesses other than the clerk. A marriage license filed less than 48 hours after Emily's funeral. The town, already reeling, went silent in disbelief. At first, people assumed it was a clerical error, a mistake in the system, but the paperwork was real. The signatures were real, and so was the ring Linda now wore. A small silver band that Emily once called too plain for her taste. Detective Holloway was among the first to hear the news. He had been following Daniel closely, waiting for a break. Now he had one. A man whose wife had just been murdered had legally married his mother-in-law 2 days after burying her. It wasn't just strange, it was disturbing. The kind of twist that made a seasoned detective's instincts scream. He reviewed Daniel's earlier statements again. Calm. No stutters. No emotion. The man had even asked if the house would be released soon, so he could start moving forward. At the time, Holloway had thought it was just an odd choice of words. Now it sounded like a man cleaning up after a job. He called in forensics to do another sweep of the house, this time with fresh eyes and a new theory. Maybe the killer hadn't fled. Maybe they never left. Maybe they just moved from one role to another, from husband to widower, from widower to son-in-law, and now back to husband again. Zoe couldn't stay silent. She brought Holloway the photo of Linda in Daniel's hoodie, taken unknowingly during her visit. She told him about the strange calm, the cryptic words, the closeness between the two. It was enough to raise more questions than answers, but in a case where nothing made sense, every small detail mattered. Daniel Price wasn't mourning, Linda Carter wasn't grieving, and Emily Carter Price, full of life and kindness, was buried beneath lies that were only just beginning to rise to the surface. 2 days after the funeral, the courthouse clerk stamped a document that no one in Branford could have imagined. Daniel Price had legally married Linda Carter. Emily's husband and her mother were now husband and wife. The news, when it broke, sent shockwaves through the community. People gasped in grocery aisles. Friends stopped answering phone calls. Neighbors refused to speak to either of them. It wasn't just wrong. It felt sick. The courthouse staff, who handled the paperwork, had assumed Linda was a different woman. No one thought to question it. There was no ceremony, no photos, no celebration. Just a cold, legal agreement between two people who should have been grieving the same loss, not signing marriage papers. When the marriage license surfaced publicly, it listed Daniel as a widower and Linda as a widow. The same last name, Price, was written next to each of theirs now. Detective Holloway stared at the document for nearly a full minute, unable to process what he was looking at. He had been suspicious of Daniel from the beginning, but this was something far darker than he had imagined. It wasn't just a crime of passion anymore. It smelled like planning. It smelled like motive. He immediately filed for a deeper background check into both of them. He wanted financial records, phone logs, internet histories, anything that could explain how this twisted connection began and what it might be hiding. Within hours, patterns started to emerge. Late-night text between Daniel and Linda, dating back nearly 8 months, deleted emails, bank transfers. None of it looked like the behavior of in-laws staying in touch. It looked like a secret affair hiding in plain sight. Meanwhile, Zoe Mitchell found herself caught between fear and fury. She had spent years by Emily's side, through high school, college, her wedding. She remembered how much Emily had idolized her mother, never suspecting betrayal. Zoe had seen them as a close-knit family, but now everything looked like a lie. She started replaying conversations in her head, wondering how she had missed the signs. Why did Emily always brush off Daniel's late nights in the garage? Why did Linda always seem to drop by when Daniel was home alone? Zoe brought Holloway something else, an old photo of a Thanksgiving dinner taken just a year before. In it, Daniel and Linda were seated next to each other, smiling in a way that now looked different. At the time, it had seemed innocent. Now it looked like a crack in a mask. The town turned cold toward the newlyweds. At the diner, people refused to serve them. At the grocery store, eyes followed them down every aisle. Some people yelled insults under their breath. Others just walked away in disgust. Linda, who had once been a respected figure in the community, now found herself a pariah. But neither she nor Daniel seemed to care. They went about their lives as if nothing had happened, appearing in public as a couple without shame or apology. Holloway knew that meant one thing. They thought they had gotten away with it. But he also knew something else. People who feel safe make mistakes. And now, Daniel and Linda were acting too comfortable, too soon. He was convinced the marriage wasn't just immoral, it was the final step in a carefully laid plan. The question now wasn't whether Daniel had killed Emily. The question was whether Linda had helped him do it. The detective assigned 2 officers to quietly monitor the couple's movements while he began building his timeline. He didn't have hard proof yet, but everything pointed toward conspiracy. What remained was to uncover the moment that planning turned into murder. The moment they decided Emily had to die. In Branford, the story had started with a murder. But now, it was spiraling into something far worse, a cold, deliberate betrayal that was still unraveling, one thread at a time. The second search of the house began just after sunset. Detective Holloway didn't want noise or attention. He wanted focus. The original sweep had missed too much. Back then, no one was thinking about a hidden relationship or a conspiracy. Now, with Daniel and Linda legally married, everything had to be seen with new eyes. He brought in a new team, quiet, thorough, and experienced in uncovering secrets buried deep inside ordinary homes. They started with the attic. The narrow wooden stairs creaked under every step. Dust covered nearly every surface. Boxes, old photo frames, and holiday decorations sat untouched for years. At first, nothing stood out, until a small cedar chest was discovered behind a row of plastic storage bins. It was locked. There was no key in sight. Holloway gave the nod, and an officer popped it open with a flathead screwdriver. Inside they found a stack of journals, all belonging to Emily. The first was dated 5 years ago, shortly after she married Daniel. The handwriting was neat, the entries full of small daily thoughts, school stories, recipes, plans for future vacations. But as they flipped further through the pages, the tone shifted. The last journal was stained with the edge of something reddish-brown. Maybe old wine, maybe not. The entry from the final few weeks before her murder were heavy with worry. Emily had been writing almost every day. The content was disturbing. She wrote about feeling watched in her own home. She described hearing soft whispers at night, just outside the bedroom door. Once, she woke to find her mother's perfume lingering in the hallway when Linda was supposedly staying at her own place. Emily had begun locking the bedroom door. She mentioned Daniel coming home late, smelling like women's shampoo. She asked herself over and over, "Am I imagining things?" One entry stood out, dated just 4 days before her death. "I found a mug in the sink with lipstick on it. My shade, but I didn't use it today. I think someone was in the house while I was at school. I feel like I'm being erased, slowly, and I don't know why." Another, more chilling entry came 2 days before her murder. "Last night I heard Daniel and Mom talking in the kitchen. I didn't make a sound. I stood in the hallway and listened. They were whispering. He said something about time running out. She told him to be patient. I don't know what they meant. I went back to bed pretending to sleep, but I haven't slept since." Detective Holloway placed that journal into an evidence bag with extra care. This was more than suspicion. This was fear documented in her own handwriting, leading up to the day she was found dead on her kitchen floor. It felt like a cry for help that never reached anyone in time. Elsewhere in the attic, an officer found something else, an envelope labeled "To be opened if something happens to me." Inside was a USB drive. Holloway didn't open it yet. He wanted the lab to do that properly. No room for mistakes now. Back at the station, Holloway laid the journals out across his desk. He began drawing timelines, linking journal entries to known dates and behaviors. Every sentence written by Emily was a puzzle piece, and slowly, the picture became clearer. She hadn't just feared something was wrong, she had been certain, and no one had listened. It became more apparent than ever. Emily didn't just die, she was silenced, and someone, maybe both Daniel and Linda, had been planning it long before the knife ever touched her skin. For Holloway, the attic had become a crime scene of its own. Not one filled with blood, but with quiet, terrifying truth. The kind that hides in plain sight until it's too late. Detective Holloway always believed that money, not hate, was the true engine behind most murders. So when the marriage between Daniel and Linda made the headlines, he dug deeper, not into their pasts this time, but into their pockets. What he uncovered turned suspicion into a sharp, undeniable motive. The breakthrough came from a quiet call to Ridgewood Mutual, a mid-sized insurance company known for handling family policies. A polite clerk named Diane confirmed something shocking. 3 months before Emily was killed, a $500,000 life insurance policy had been opened in her name. The policy listed Linda Carter as the sole beneficiary. Emily's signature was on the documents, but when Holloway sent it to handwriting analysis, the results came back with a simple, devastating word: forged. Emily had never signed the policy. She hadn't even known it existed. Even more alarming, the policy had been activated just 10 days after Emily's routine doctor visit, where she had noted stress and sleep issues on her intake form. That visit had been followed by a brief but odd conversation Daniel once had with a nurse, asking questions about how medical records impacted insurance payouts. The nurse remembered it because Daniel wasn't even the patient. According to the insurance company, Daniel had personally called to verify the policy was active on the same day he allegedly discovered Emily's body. The claim itself had been filed only a day later. He hadn't even waited for the funeral. Holloway was stunned by the timing. It didn't feel like grief. It felt like strategy. Digging into bank records, Holloway found a series of cash deposits made to Linda's account within days of the policy being filed. Small amounts at first, just enough to stay under the radar, then larger ones funneled through a second checking account tied to a business Daniel had shut down 6 months earlier. He'd claimed bankruptcy. But now, suddenly, money was flowing again. It became clear this wasn't just a case of infidelity. It was a plan built on financial gain. Daniel and Linda weren't just lovers, They were partners in something calculated and cruel. They didn't kill Emily in the heat of passion. They removed her like a problem standing in the way of profit. Even more disturbing, Emily had once mentioned something about life insurance to her best friend Zoe a year earlier. At the time, it was a joke. She said Daniel thought insurance was a scam and refused to waste money on it. Zoe remembered laughing, saying her own husband was the same way, but now, it was clear Daniel had changed his mind and never told his wife. Holloway pieced it all together on his office whiteboard. At the center was Emily, surrounded by 3 connecting lines: Daniel, Linda, and $500,000. All roads led back to that policy. It was the clearest motive he'd found: greed dressed up in the lies of love and marriage. He called in a financial crimes analyst to trace the insurance money. So far, only part of it had been withdrawn, but more had been approved. Linda had scheduled a wire transfer set to process in 3 days, just enough time to flee, maybe disappear. Holloway suspected it, and he couldn't afford to wait. He issued a quiet freeze on the accounts and began drafting warrants. He needed to move fast. The money, the marriage, the murder, they were all steps in the same twisted staircase. And if Daniel and Linda realized the walls were closing in, they might vanish before justice could catch up. Holloway stared at the forged signature one more time. Emily's name, written in shaky, unnatural strokes. A name used not to protect her, but to profit from her death. That signature wasn't just fake, it was fatal. Zoe Mitchell hadn't stopped thinking about Emily since the funeral. Her friend's face haunted her sleep, open-eyed, smiling in memories, silent in death. But it wasn't just grief pulling her under, it was something darker. A sense that she had missed something, that she could have stopped it, that maybe Emily had tried to tell her something, and she hadn't listened. The moment it all changed came late one evening, when Zoe decided to scroll through old voice messages. She had saved a few of Emily's over the years, random ones about brunch plans or book recommendations. But something strange caught her eye. A voice memo unopened, sitting near the top. It had been recorded just a week before Emily's murder. Zoe had never noticed it before. She hit play. Emily's voice came through, low and shaky, like she was whispering through fear. "Zoe, I don't know what to do. I found Mom in the bathroom wearing Daniel's shirt. She told me she spilled something and borrowed it, but she looked nervous. She wouldn't meet my eyes, and Daniel lied about where he was last night. Said he was in the garage. I checked. His tools hadn't been touched." There was a pause, followed by a long breath. "I think something's going on between them. I know how it sounds, but I can't ignore it anymore. I don't feel safe, Zoe. Something is wrong in this house." Zoe's heart pounded as the message ended. She sat in silence for a long time, holding her phone like it was about to explode. Every word Emily spoke replayed in her head like thunder. The fear was real, and Zoe had it in her hands, proof that Emily had suspected her husband and her own mother were hiding something. And now, with Emily gone and those two married, the implications were unbearable. The next morning, she drove straight to the station, skipping work and skipping breakfast. Detective Holloway met her in the parking lot, surprised to see her so early. She played the message for him right there in his car. No words, no explanations, just Emily's voice, trembling and afraid, delivering her last known warning. When the message ended, Holloway said nothing for a full minute. Then he told her, quietly, that this changed everything. With the journals, the insurance fraud, and now this recording, Holloway had something he didn't have before: Emily's own voice confirming her suspicion. This wasn't speculation. This was a woman, 1 week from death, telling someone she felt unsafe in her home, telling someone her husband and her mother were lying. And now that woman was buried. Holloway had the voicemail analyzed for authenticity. No cuts, no edits. It was genuine. It had been recorded the night Emily said she saw Linda in Daniel's clothes. It matched with a gap in Daniel's timeline, one of the nights he claimed to be working late. But no one could confirm that. Now Emily herself had unknowingly confirmed he was lying. But there was more. Zoe remembered something else. A conversation weeks earlier, when Emily had joked that she was writing her own little mystery novel in her journal. At the time, Zoe thought it was just her friend being quirky. But now, paired with the journals from the attic and the voicemail, it looked like Emily had been documenting her fear from all angles. Paper, voice, thoughts. Holloway added the voicemail to the growing evidence folder, now thick with layers of betrayal. The pieces were snapping together, but with every answer, more questions appeared. How long had Daniel and Linda planned this? Were there others involved? And most importantly, how far were they willing to go to keep their secrets buried? The truth was rising fast now, clawing its way out of the dark. Emily had left clues, even as no one saw them. But now someone had, and justice was beginning to take shape in the sound of her voice. Detective Ray Holloway had waited patiently, watching, listening, collecting fragments of truth. But now, with Emily's journals, the forged life insurance policy, the secret marriage, and the chilling voicemail, the pieces had formed a clear picture. It was time to act. There were no more doubts. Daniel Price didn't just lose his wife. He orchestrated her murder. And Linda Carter, the grieving mother, hadn't just stood by. She had helped him do it. Holloway moved quietly, issuing arrest warrants for both. He didn't want the town alerted. He didn't want a scene. He wanted them caught off guard, stripped of their carefully crafted lies. The plan was simple. Officers would pick Daniel up at his repair shop, and Linda at the home they now shared, Emily's former home. The irony wasn't lost on Holloway. They were living in the very house where they had taken her life, sleeping in her bed, using her dishes, pretending they had earned it. Daniel was the first to be brought in. He didn't resist. In fact, he looked almost bored as he was handcuffed and placed in the back of the cruiser. He asked if this was another round of questioning. The officer didn't answer, but when Daniel was led past the station lobby and into an interrogation room, he knew something was different. Linda, arrested less than an hour later, was colder. She said nothing. Her face gave away nothing. But Holloway saw her eyes twitch slightly when he mentioned the voicemail. She hadn't known about that. He could tell. Inside the room, Holloway laid it all out, starting not with accusations, but with Emily's voice. He played the recording slowly, letting every word hang in the stale air. Daniel sat perfectly still, but his eyes darted. Holloway watched him closely. Then he placed Emily's journal pages on the table, one by one, pages where she described their secret late-night talks, her fears, the feeling that her life was being quietly dismantled around her. Daniel glanced at the door, just once, a small reflex. Not to escape, but as if he wished he could. Then Holloway mentioned the insurance policy, the forged signature, the wire transfer Linda had set up, and finally, the marriage, just 2 days after Emily's funeral. The timeline was airtight. The motive was obvious. The question left was whether Daniel would admit it. For a moment Daniel said nothing. Then, with a hollow laugh, he leaned back and said only, "It was supposed to be easier than this." That was all Holloway needed. Daniel confessed over the next 2 hours, not because of guilt, but because of inevitability. He told the story like it was someone else's life, distant and mechanical. He and Linda had started an affair nearly a year before Emily's death. At first it was secretive, shameful, but then it became something more, something dangerous. They convinced themselves they were in love. They wanted to start fresh. But Emily stood in the way. Linda proposed the idea. Daniel executed it. She distracted Emily with a fake call about a broken light, while he snuck into the house early that morning. It was fast, clean. The knife was wrapped and dumped miles away. They had rehearsed it all. Linda, when confronted with the confession, said nothing. She stared at the wall and muttered only once. She wasn't supposed to find out. The town of Branford would never be the same. By the end of the week, both were charged with conspiracy to commit murder, insurance fraud, and first-degree homicide. The house on Maple Drive was sealed with police tape once again, this time for good. Justice had finally caught up. But for Emily, it had come too late. And for those left behind, like Zoe and the townspeople who once admired Linda, the betrayal would linger like a wound that never fully closed. Branford was never meant to be the kind of place people read about in crime magazines or saw featured in late-night documentaries. It was small, peaceful, and wrapped in the kind of comfort that made residents believe evil lived elsewhere. But after the arrest and public trial of Daniel Price and Linda Carter, that illusion was shattered forever. The town didn't just lose one of its own, they lost their sense of safety, their trust in neighbors, and the belief that monsters wore unfamiliar faces. The courthouse was filled on the day of sentencing. Locals gathered outside, watching as reporters stood shoulder to shoulder waiting for the verdict that had already been written in the confessions and evidence. Inside, Daniel sat calmly, his eyes vacant, no longer trying to defend himself. Linda, seated just a few feet away, didn't look at him once. The bond that had seemed unbreakable during the months after Emily's death had crumbled the moment the truth came out. Love built on blood had no roots. The judge spoke clearly and without sympathy. Life in prison without the possibility of parole for both. The courtroom was silent. No one wept, no one cheered. The horror of what had been done left no room for emotion. Just emptiness. Zoe Mitchell stood at the back, gripping Emily's old scarf in her hands. She had worn it for warmth, but also for courage. In the months since her friend's murder, Zoe had become the keeper of Emily's truth. She had spoken to detectives, testified at hearings, and walked through memories that had turned into evidence. Now, with justice served, she felt only sorrow. Emily wasn't coming back, and what had been taken could never be returned. After the trial, the home on Maple Drive sat dark for weeks. Then the town quietly voted to condemn it. No one wanted to live in a house where betrayal had taken its final form. The garden Emily once loved wilted without care. The curtains remained drawn. Weeds overtook the walkway. Eventually, the property was bulldozed. All that remained was a patch of dirt where secrets had once been buried beneath floorboards. Emily's grave, however, became a quiet place of remembrance. People left fresh flowers every week. A student of hers placed a drawing each month. Zoe visited often, speaking to her friend as if she could still hear. The new gravestone read, "Beloved daughter, teacher, and friend, your voice led them to truth." The phrase came from the voicemail, the one thing Emily left behind that no one could ignore. The townspeople began to talk about her not as a victim, but as a woman who had tried to warn the world. Her fear had become her strength. Her journal, her recordings, they weren't just entries and files. They were her voice, refusing to be silenced. And in the end, that voice broke through everything. Detective Holloway quietly retired months after the trial. He left behind a long career, but the case followed him. He had solved many crimes, but none that left a mark like this one. He kept a copy of Emily's last journal entry in his desk drawer. He said it reminded him that evil doesn't always enter through broken windows. Sometimes it walks through the front door, smiles at you, and says it loves you. Branford moved on, slowly. The story faded from the headlines. But it never faded from memory. Everyone knew the tale. A man who married his mother-in-law just 2 days after killing his wife. A plan built on love, twisted into greed, and a woman who saw the truth too late, but left just enough behind to speak after she was gone.